Welcome everyone for joining us today. My name is Dorothy Siao Asamoah. I'm a clinical associate professor in the Department of Organization and Human Resources. I'm also the faculty director of global programs here in the school. On behalf of CLOE, thank you everyone for attending 52 weeks of leadership. And I want to acknowledge our sponsor, GEICO. I'd like to also remind you that about our upcoming international conference on June 3rd, featuring Danielle Pink. We hope you register now if you haven't, and we look forward to seeing you. Now to our speaker for today. It is such an honor for me and a pleasure to introduce our speaker to you this morning. Her name is Dr. Marsha King, co-director of CLOE Leadership Coaching Certificate Program and president and founder of SkillPoint Consulting. Marsha's featured topic this week is inclusive leadership. And before I give you a brief description, Marsha doesn't just teach this, she lives it. Creating a diverse workforce is important for an organization's success, but it doesn't end here. Leaders must be intentional in how they engage, in how they value, in how they involve, and capitalize on the strengths of everyone on their team. This presentation discusses key critical behaviors of inclusive leaders. Details for each behavior, as well as resources and strategies, will be discussed. Marsha is a well-respected faculty member at UB, where she oversees our executive coaching certificate program. Thank you so much for being here. And it is again my pleasure to welcome you to 52 weeks of leadership. But before I sign off, I want to remind you of next week. Our featured speaker will be Dr. Kate, who will be talking about leadership and negotiation. Marsha.
All right, Dorothy, thank you so much for that kind introduction. So appreciate being partners with you. And welcome everybody. I'm excited to be here today and to get the opportunity to talk to you about inclusive leadership. So here's the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit. You can't talk about inclusion unless you talk about diversity. So I'm going to touch on that for a moment. We're going to talk about what inclusive leadership is. I've also identified 4 critical behaviors of inclusive leaders and then some next steps. All right, so I wanted to start with a very quick story, however, because I think it's a really good example of what inclusive leadership looks like. And this was several years ago, is when it was right out of grad school and I'd started a new job. And you know how you feel on the first day of your new job, there's a lot of anxiety. You know, you're hoping that you meet a few people, that you're able to listen, you're able to learn, and hopefully find the bathrooms. But that's really about the extent of what you are hoping to get out of it. So I show up on my first day and I'm greeted by a group of wonderful people who are very warm and welcoming. And what I find out is that they've already established my schedule for the week, actually for 2 weeks. And my first day, they've assigned me to 3 projects. So this is a consulting firm and it's a matrix organization. And so there's no real managers, there's project leaders. And so they assigned me to 3 projects. I was thrilled with that. And they were 3 nice projects. But I had to have update meetings. We had update meetings every day with our project leaders. So I attended my first session and the leader's name was John. And John was incredibly welcoming. And he went to great lengths to tell people why they hired me, what they expected to get from working with me, the expertise that I bring to the table. And then people asked questions about it. And I was really kind of surprised by that. I knew I was going to be treated well, but I was really shocked at the level of how warm and welcoming they were. And then throughout the rest of the meeting, they included me in the conversation. They asked me questions about my expertise. They wanted my opinion about various topics. And I just felt incredibly invited and warm. It was warm and welcoming to me. I had 2 more project meetings throughout the day and the same thing happened. And, you know, I was reflecting after my first week. I always try to do some reflection on how things went. And my reflections were that I was welcomed, I was valued, and I was included. And it made a huge difference for me. The anxiety went away. And what I got from this is I felt wanted and I felt like I mattered. In the first day, the very first day, I felt like I mattered. And what I found out later in the days and weeks to come is that they actually had a strategy for this. When we think about onboarding and starting new jobs, we typically think of the first 90 days. They think of the first 90 hours. And their philosophy is that if you can win the hearts and minds of new employees within the first 2 weeks, they have a much better chance of being successful. And it worked. I mean, it was certainly true in my case. I've never felt since then, unfortunately, so welcomed and so warm and included in an organization. I thought it was a great strategy. I think that's a really good example of inclusion. All right, so we can't really talk about inclusion unless we talk about diversity for a moment. So I wanted to give you a framework in which to think about diversity as we maneuver through this presentation today. All right, so you'll see before you 3 columns: visible dimensions, secondary dimensions, and situational dimensions. Visible dimensions are the ones that we're more familiar with, that we typically think of when we think about diversity. It's things like race, ethnicity, gender, age. But then there's all these secondary dimensions that we usually think about, but they don't seem quite as important, or as, we don't focus on them quite as much, but they're still, important: religion, sexual orientation, education, socioeconomics. But then there's this whole situational dimensions that we don't tend to think about, that I want us to include in this, because situational dimensions are situations that people move in and out of that make them different. And so what diversity is all about difference and differences. And it's people like expats, single parents, different personality styles, different work styles, tenure. The example I gave to you for myself was tenure. I was a brand new employee, and therefore I'm different. And they went to great lengths to make sure that I felt welcomed and invited. And really, basically, what this all comes down to is I want you to think of diversity as anyone who may have less of a voice because of their differences. All right. So we also need to differentiate diversity from inclusion, because this conversation is about the inclusion side. But again, I want to differentiate this for you and create some distinctions. So if you look at this, this is a Deloitte framework, which I really like, the diversity and inclusion maturity model. I think Deloitte did a nice job. And what you'll see on the left-hand side, there's level 1 and 2. And level 1 and 2 really are more about diversity. And it's about creating a workforce that's diverse, has different backgrounds and experiences and so on. But after level 2, there's this transition point. And the transition point really is when you become a diverse workforce, what do you do about it? So creating a diverse workforce is critical. And we all know all the benefits that come from it. I'm not going to build a business case today because it's been built. We know that creating a diverse workforce does wonders and is very good for the organization and the bottom line. But what happens when we create the diverse workforce? The second side, which is inclusion. I've often heard about this as diversity is like asking someone to a party, but inclusion is asking them to dance. And so I'm taking this from that dance perspective and the leader's perspective today. So we're going to talk about what leaders can do and should be doing to create to create inclusion in a workforce. All right. So I've worked with a lot of leaders over the years, and what I did was I thought about who were the most inclusive of those leaders, and I've fortunately had an opportunity to work with many of them. And I pulled out what I thought were the most critical. So I actually started this process and ended up with like 12 or 15. I narrowed this down further. Finally was able to get it to what I think as the 4 most critical behaviors that inclusive leaders demonstrate. And here they are. All right. They're intentional. They're intentional about being inclusive. They have emotional intelligence. They show empathy, and they advocate for people. Now, when you look at this list, you're naturally going to think, well, of course, this makes sense. These are important for all leaders. Absolutely, they are. I'm going to pull out specific pieces of each one of them, though, that I think are even more important if you're going to be an inclusive leader. All right, so intentional. So inclusive leaders are intentional about being inclusive. They don't shoot from the hip. They don't do this on a whim. They actually think about it. They think about it, they make the decision to do it. And they have to think about who do they want to be as an inclusive leader. They also have to consider what comes naturally to them and what doesn't, because I would tell you, this is a skill that doesn't come naturally to many of us, to most of us. Several years ago, I decided I wanted to learn a musical instrument, and I have never picked up an instrument before in my life. And I was really hoping that I had some kind of um, inclination for this, or some kind of natural ability in music. And I decided to take violin. And in hindsight, it probably wasn't the right instrument because it's so difficult. But I started taking the lessons, and I had absolutely no natural ability in this. That was probably one of the biggest things that was surprising to me. I had have no ability in this. I had nothing came naturally to me at all. And it was just so shocking to me that I spent the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 lessons learning how to hold the instrument. And I had no idea that a 2-pound piece of wood got so heavy when you had your elbows in the air for an hour, but it did. But I actually got better and better at it. But that's because I had to ask myself what comes naturally to me and what doesn't. And what doesn't come natural to you, you can still compensate for. You just have to compensate for it. Inclusive leaders create a plan. You know, we've all heard that adage about a great idea without a plan is just a dream. Well, you know, this is true in this case as well. It is just a dream unless you create a plan around it. So inclusive leaders create a plan for themselves, and they also ask for feedback. They recognize that they can't do this alone. And so they ask the people around them to support them. And that's actually a great segue into the second critical behavior, which is emotional intelligence. Now I'm going to pull out a very particular piece of emotional intelligence, and that's around self-awareness. And there are one specific area where we need greater self-awareness if we're going to be inclusive, and that's around our blind spots, around our biases, around our tendencies. I call these the BBTs. So blind spot, we all have them. You know, research tells us that the average person has about 3 blind spots. I have about 12 blind spots, but I'm an overachiever. So don't do as I do. Do as I say, not as I do. You don't want 12 blind spots. But all kidding aside, so in the last year, I was trying to think of a good example of blind spots, and here's a really good one. In the last year during the pandemic, I worked with a lot of leaders that you could divide them into 2 categories. And one was leaders that immediately understood what the workforce was going through, that they were struggling, that they had fear, they had anxiety. They felt isolated when we started working from home. They immediately got that. But there was this whole other group that didn't understand that. They personally didn't feel it, and they assumed that everybody felt like they did. And they had a really hard time helping the organization move through this. It was a very clear distinction between these 2 groups. That was a blind spot, the blind spot that everyone must feel like I feel because this is how I feel. And it just, it wasn't the case. But, again, any blind spot can be uncovered. And once uncovered, you can then work on it. So why is this important? Just basically what I just said. Awareness of our blind spots, our biases, and our tendencies gives us the ability to manage and control them. And if you manage and control them, you have a chance of much greater inclusive leadership. If we don't control them, then it's going to be much harder for us. All right. So here's a couple resources for you. Project Implicit by Harvard is a great resource. It's a series of assessments that they've created that will help you to examine your own implicit attitudes towards race, gender, sexual orientation, and a whole lot more. I went on, they literally take a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the most to take these. They're free to anybody, very simple, very accessible. I definitely recommend it. I think I was actually surprised on a couple of things. So it absolutely uncovers some thoughts and attitudes that you may have that you may not be aware of. This is another one I really like. This is Wikipedia. And if you go to Wikipedia and type in cognitive bias code X, this will pop up, this very complex graphic. But what you'll see in the inner ring are 180 types of bias. And it's interactive, so you can click on any of those and it takes you to a page that gives you a description and information about this bias. And they make it more simplistic because they're divided into 4 categories and it's color coded, which helps as well. But again, another resource to help you examine, do you have a bias? Where is it? And then you can combat it. By the nature of a bias, a tendency, or a blind spot is we don't know what they are. We have to discover them. And if we don't dig in and figure that out, it's going to be very difficult. Okay, so I'm going to go into the fourth one. So the fourth, and the first two, intentional and emotional intelligence, to me, those are kind of the foundation. Empathy and advocacy are where you can go from good to great. And so I really encourage you to learn more about each of these. I think they're very powerful and can make a significant difference on our ability to be an inclusive leader. All right, so let's talk about empathy. So what is empathy? It's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. For the purposes of this presentation, the so that is so that you can build an emotional connection with them. And once you can develop an emotional connection with someone, all kinds of great things can happen. Think about a manager that you've had that you felt really understood you, really took the time to understand your feelings and where you're coming from. It can be very powerful. It elevates your performance. It elevates the performance around you. It makes you a more inclusive leader. So it becomes almost contagious. So absolutely, the emotional connection is created, and inclusive leaders are able to create that. All right, so the first thing you need to have empathy for are my art skills. They're right up there with my music talent. So what you see in front of you is a bridge. And on one side of the bridge, you have the leader. And the leader comes to the table with their own agenda, goals, beliefs, assumptions, preferences, opinions, interests, strengths, and more. You'll see on the other side of the bridge is the employee, and an employee comes with all those things as well. The leader's not the only one that has those. They both have these. And then when we think about empathy, we often think it's about understanding each other. And the visual that we would typically have in our mind would be something like this, where these two come together, they share information about one another. And I'm not saying this is bad, this is good, this is really good, but this is not empathy. This is more collaboration. And we need more of this, certainly. But let me talk about what real empathy is. And one of the distinctions I should make is that in this situation, it is the leader's responsibility to take the initiative on empathy. So this is more of what empathy looks like in the work context and by inclusive leaders. What you see is that the leader has left behind everything. They've left behind their agenda, goals, beliefs, assumptions, all that. They leave their stuff. They cross the bridge. They take the initiative to cross the bridge. They're the ones bridging the gap between themselves and the employees. So they go to the employee side, and the employee keeps their agenda, goals, beliefs, assumptions, all that stuff. The employee keeps it. So the leader is there with nothing. The employee is there with all the stuff that they carry around, all the stuff they believe in. And that's what we want. This is the leader's opportunity to do nothing but listen and ask questions, where they can learn about all these things, where the employee has the opportunity to talk about all those things. But it has to be without judgment. So if a leader is listening and asking questions with judgment, it's not empathy. What you want is a leader that's going to listen and ask questions without judgment. And if they don't leave all their stuff behind, it's very, very difficult to do this. So that's the first step, is for them to leave all their stuff behind, cross the bridge, listen and ask questions without judgment. Now, any statement can be turned into a question by putting a question mark behind it. It doesn't mean it's really a question. So we have to be careful with what these questions are. I could ask somebody the question, "You're not really going to do that, are you?" Is that really a question? It has a question mark at the end. It's not really a question, it's a statement. And the statement is, "You're not smart." And so that's where judgment can creep in if we're not careful. We tend to use questions as our armor or as our tools. What I ask people to do is listen and ask questions with a pure heart. Avoid the judgment, leave your stuff behind. That's when an employee can start to open up, and they will share all of these things. And this is the stuff that the leader needs to know. More importantly, if the leader approaches the employee without judgment, they'll also share these things: feelings, concerns, fears, hope, dreams, aspirations. This is the sweet spot. This is what we want to have happen. And that's when emotional connection can happen. So the employee ends up feeling like the leader gets it. they get the situation. But if the leader is also paying attention to the things below the surface, I purposely made feelings, concerns, fears, I purposely made all those things below the bridge because I wanted it to show that these are really beneath the surface. If a leader approaches an employee and sincerely asks questions and listens without judgment and gets to all of these, what's above and below, not only do they get it, but they get them. They get them. And again, this is where you want to get. This is where you want to be. You want a leader who gets it, who gets the employee, what they're going through, but they understand what's going on behind the scenes, peels the onion back and sees the feelings, the concerns, the aspirations, the dreams, all of that. That's what you want. And that is empathy. When you do that, you naturally become more inclusive. All right, let's go into the last behavior. So this is the last behavior is about being an advocate. And I want to introduce a new framework for you. All right, so I think of advocacy in two buckets. One are micro advocacies and macro advocacies. And so the macro, they're larger, more visible ways to support diversity and inclusion efforts at the organizational level. We've all been involved in them. They're very important. We need them. They work towards helping us create a more diverse workforce. But there's also this whole area of micro advocacy that I think we've totally missed the boat on. These are smaller, more subtle, frequent, and personal ways to support someone who may be at risk of not having a voice or not feeling included. I think this is where we have a lot of way to go, but we also have, this can make a significant difference. So let me give you some examples of these. Macro advocacies are things like sponsoring or participating in an affinity group, actively recruiting diverse candidates, conducting compensation, job level reviews to promote equity and fairness. I mean, again, these things are critical. We need to have them. And this is just 3 out of however many. The list could go on forever. But let me talk about the micro advocacies, because these are the subtle things that happen to people when they have less of a voice because they're different. Seek diverse opinions and ideas and give them credit for their ideas publicly. Most of us on this call have experienced sitting in a meeting, stating a thought or idea, it gets overlooked, and a few minutes later, someone else says it, and they get credit for it. This happens all the time, and it happens to diverse people more. And so this is something as leaders we need to watch for and correct. And again, doing it publicly is really important. If you do it behind the scenes, it's nice and it's helps create relationship between the two, but doing publicly actually helps them. That is what helps them to regain the voice that they deserve to have. The second one is finding opportunities to agree with or support people, again, publicly. This is what inclusive leaders do. They find opportunities to agree, and then they do it, and they show people and they demonstrate it as a model. We should be listening more. We should be taking opportunities to support all people. Support people by pointing out their successes, their potential, and their strengths. Invite and include diverse people to events, both personal and professional. And this is kind of like what I mentioned earlier. It's like being invited to a party, but not being involved in the activities. We need both of these. And both personal and professional. Somewhere along the line, we decided that addressing emotions or addressing personal things is not appropriate for work. And, it's just a cop-out. It is appropriate for work. We are emotional animals. We're not going to lose that. You don't go to work and become a robot. We have to accept that emotions exist, both professionally and personally. And if we deny that, and we try to separate them, it's very difficult to be inclusive. It's very difficult to make those emotional connections with people. It's very difficult to lead people in that way. People don't want to be, we've asked the wrong question about leadership. We shouldn't be asking ourselves, how do we lead? We should ask ourselves, why do people follow? And people follow because they feel connected to you. And so ignoring the emotional side is not going to help. All right. And then finally, initiate and understand career aspirations and be prepared to share those. Diverse people miss out on opportunities all the time. And oftentimes it's because no one realizes what their aspirations are. No one realizes what their career goals are. And so take the time, inclusive leaders take the time to understand those things, and they're willing to share them. All right. So at this point, I have put in a Q&A. If there aren't questions, I have a few more slides to go through, but I'm going to stop and pause and see if there's any questions. I think Dorothy.
Yes, there are some questions for you, Dr. King. The first one comes from my new friend I just met on chat, Michael. Question goes, is the current move toward increased diversity a curative for ageism in hiring, or is this still a barrier to overcome?
Ageism in hiring. I don't know. I wish I could say, and I'll tell you my thoughts about age discrimination they're frightening, because every single one of us are going to face it. And we absolutely have to conquer it and find a way to overcome it, because it's coming. It's here for many of us. I'm not going to pretend like I have the answer, though. I apologize. Connect with me after this, and I can direct you to some research that might help, or some people who might know this answer better.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Next question. As a leader, how do we open ourselves to feedback from the employee to ensure we are getting it and getting them?
Such a good question, because it's very difficult to uncover your own blind spots, because you don't even know what to look for. And so feedback is the key to that. And there's a lot of ways. One is create an environment where people feel free to give feedback. So a psychologically safe environment where giving feedback is not punitive. Giving feedback is rewarded. And so your openness to the feedback and how receptive you are to the feedback is really going to dictate how people are going to feel about giving it to you. And if you're open and receptive, they're going to be better at it. The other option is to get it confidentially. And you can do that in a multitude of ways, an electronic survey or a leadership coach that you're working with who can collect it. But that's another way to get it. But the first way is by far my favorite. It's create an environment where people feel free to express themselves and share ideas and thoughts and provide feedback that could even be difficult to hear.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. Can you speak to how to balance your advocacy so that you are actually heard? Sometimes if you keep advocating, people around you get tired and can stop listening.
Okay, so how to make sure that when you advocate, if you advocate a lot, that it's still heard?
Yes, that your ideas are being heard. Because sometimes you feel like you're advocating and people around you get tired and can stop listening.
Yeah. Absolutely, that can happen. And so maybe it's about advocating in more private forums. Maybe it's actually maybe a multitude of forums. Maybe once it's publicly in a meeting, but maybe the next time it's privately behind an office door. And maybe it's picking battles too, and recognizing that we're not going to solve the world's problems overnight, and that sometimes it's really about what are the small things that we can do, and allow those to pile up instead of feeling like we have to. And I'm stumbling over this because I actually don't know the answer that well, and I apologize for that, but it's all in the delivery. That's really what it comes down to. It's how often and what forums, and even tone of voice of how it happens. People can only hear so much information, and that is true, but they also need to hear it in multiple ways. And so I would just be super careful about how you're doing it, when you're doing it, in what forums, and be planful about it.
Wonderful. One more question.
Sure.
Are those that regularly offer ideas and thinking outside an organization's norm considered in the minority and minimized more often than not?
All right, repeat that to me one more time, Dorothy.
Are those that regularly offer ideas outside the organization's norm considered in the minority, and I'm adding my own word here, and therefore minimized more often than not?
So if they're saying the unpopular thing regularly, okay, are they considered outside of, I think it depends on the culture that you're in, but many organizations really want that, and they want people to make suggestions or have an opinion that is outside of the norm, because that's how you have innovation and creativity. So I think that really depends on the organization. I wouldn't be able to answer it, give you a blank answer for that one, unfortunately. A lot of depends, a lot of shades of gray on this topic. I know, I wish I could give you definitive answers about things, but that's very difficult. Anybody who wants to talk more about it, though, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation where we can converse back and forth and come up with some ideas and thoughts together. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. King, for your time again. And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any other questions, please feel free, visit our website. We have all the past recordings there for you, and you can contact Dr. King via email, which Molly has posted on the chat. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day and week.
Take care.